History remembers the Trojan horse as one of the greatest military victories ever achieved without a battle. For 10 years, the Greeks had failed to conquer the mighty city of Troy. Every siege had failed. Every assault had been repelled. Victory seemed impossible. Then, one morning, the Greeks were gone. In their place stood a magnificent wooden horse. The Trojans believed it was a gift, a symbol of peace, a trophy marking the end of a long and exhausting war. They celebrated. They dragged the horse through the gates of their own city. That night, while Troy slept, Greek soldiers hidden inside the horse emerged, opened the city gates, and the city fell from within. Ever since then, the phrase Trojan horse has meant something that appears to be a gift, but carries consequences hidden beneath the surface. South Africa's constitution is often described as one of the greatest constitutions ever written. It's celebrated in universities, praised by judges, admired by world leaders. Some even call it the best constitution in the world.
Africa got over apartheid. Did they just go back to their Afrikaner racist constitution and be like, oh, we just need a couple of amendments. We just need a couple of changes here to make it work? No, they threw the whole thing out and started again, this time asking everybody. Wow. This time having a completely new delegation of all of the people of South Africa, not just the white folks, but not no white folks. And they came up with a new constitution. It's one of the reasons why the South African constitution is generally thought of as one of the best constitutions in the world, and ours continues to be a piece of crap.
But we're going to talk about that in a short while. Just let's talk you back a little bit on South Africa's constitution. We had 4 constitutions. The first one was in 1910 when the country became a union. Second came in 1961. Then in 1961, when South Africa was declared a republic, the government adopted the second constitution. Then in 1983, government passed the third one, and the current one was adopted in 1994, the one that we still has now, and it's been hailed as one of the most progressive constitutions in the world by global standards.
But 30 years later, millions of South Africans are asking a very different question. If our constitution is one of the best on earth, why does one of the most unequal societies on earth still exist beneath it? Was South Africa's constitution the foundation of a new democracy? Or was it the greatest compromise the country has ever made? Or was the South African constitution a Trojan horse?
I would say that, generally speaking, most South Africans are worried about handing over South Africa politically to non-whites. They're worried about what has happened on the rest of the continent of Africa. And of course, every time anything extreme happens in one of the other areas or territories in Africa, the immediate feeling is that South Africa must retain political control in the hands of the whites.
We have to go back. The early 1990s. South Africa stood on the edge of uncertainty. The apartheid government was losing legitimacy. International sanctions were mounting. Political violence claimed thousands of lives. Many feared that South Africa was heading towards civil war. Yet somehow, the country avoided the catastrophe that many had predicted. Instead of a revolution, South Africa negotiated. Instead of one side defeating the other, both sides sat at the same table. Out of those negotiations emerged a new constitution. To the outside world, it looked remarkable, and in many respects, it was. The Constitution enshrined equality before the law. It protected freedom of speech, freedom of religion, human dignity, independent courts, the right to vote, protection from discrimination. And unlike many constitutions around the world, South Africa's even recognized socio-economic rights like access to housing, healthcare, education, and sufficient food and water. To many constitutional scholars, it became a model for modern democracies. A nation once defined by racial oppression had produced a legal document centered on human dignity and equality. That transformation earned admiration around the world. But constitutions don't exist in a vacuum. They are born from the political realities of their time. And South Africa's constitution wasn't written after one side won. It was written after both sides agreed to compromise. And that's where the debate begins. Because while compromise can stop a war, it can also mean that no one gets everything they wanted. For some, that compromise represents South Africa's greatest achievement. For others, it represents the moment the country traded one form of victory for another kind of unfinished business. The question isn't whether compromise happened. It clearly did. The real question is, what exactly was compromised?
We are all free. We have freedom of choice. We have freedom of movement. We have freedom of religion. We have a right to housing, etc., etc., etc. And it looks good on paper. Then when you read certain things and you're like, no.
Like what?
Have you ever seen the word apartheid in that constitution?
I have searched it very closely and I have not.
Have you ever seen the word atrocities in that constitution?
No.
You know why you haven't seen it? It's because that constitution, with all the other nice things that we have, is a lullaby song to ensure the continued survival of white power.
This is where many debates begin. Ask 10 South Africans what the Constitution was meant to achieve. You'll probably get 10 different answers. Some believe its primary purpose was simple: prevent civil war, protect democracy, guarantee human rights, create independent institutions, ensure that no South African would ever again be oppressed by the state because of their race. Those are extraordinary achievements. But others argue that another question deserves attention. Was the Constitution designed primarily to transform society or to manage a peaceful transition? Because those aren't always the same thing. A constitution can successfully prevent dictatorship while still leaving deep economic inequalities untouched. And that's where critics believe the real tension lies. One of the most debated aspects of South Africa's constitutional settlement concerns property. Supporters argue that constitutional protection of property rights was essential. Without legal certainty, they say, investment could collapse, businesses could flee, food production could suffer, and the fragile new democracy might never have survived its first years. They argue that protecting rights, including property rights, was part of creating a stable constitutional order. Critics see the same compromise differently. They argue that while political power changed hands, economic power changed much more slowly. Many point out that when apartheid ended, ownership of land, major industries, financial institutions, and accumulated wealth remained highly concentrated. From this perspective, democracy transformed who governed the country, but not necessarily who owned much of its economy. That doesn't mean the Constitution prohibited transformation. Far from it. It allows for land reform under certain conditions, and governments have pursued redistribution through various policies. The debate is whether those constitutional protections struck the right balance, or whether they made meaningful transformation slower, more difficult, or more legally contested than many South Africans expected. Reasonable people disagree on that question, and they have for decades. Justice or reconciliation? Another compromise often debated is justice itself. South Africa chose a path unlike many countries emerging from conflict. Instead of widespread criminal prosecutions, it established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The idea was extraordinary. Tell the truth, acknowledge what happened, give victims a chance to be heard, and in certain circumstances, perpetrators who made full disclosure could receive amnesty. To supporters, This prevented cycles of revenge. It helped South Africa avoid further bloodshed. It became an international model for reconciliation. But not everyone experienced it that way. For many victims and their families, truth did not always feel like justice. Some felt that acknowledgement came without accountability. Others argued that reconciliation arrived long before economic repair. Those tensions remain part of South Africa's national conversation today.
I would like to meet that man that threw the grenade in an attitude of forgiveness, and hope that he could forgive me too, or for whatever reason. But I would very much like to meet them.
Perhaps the biggest misunderstanding about constitutions is believing they can solve problems they were never designed to solve alone. A constitution can define rights. It can create institutions. It can limit government power. It can establish courts. It can provide mechanisms for accountability. But it cannot, by itself, create jobs, end corruption, improve education, fix municipalities, grow an economy, or erase centuries of inequality. Those things depend on politics, policy, leadership, institutions, and time. This is why today's debate is so complex. Some South Africans argue the constitution has not failed. Instead, they believe governments have failed to fully implement its promises. Others argue that implementation is only part of the story. They believe some structural compromises made in the 1990s continue to shape what is politically and legally possible today.
Which simply says land which was stolen from us, now in the hands of white people, if we want it back, we must buy it from them. And it's evil, it is unethical, it is unacceptable.
But regardless of where one stands, one fact is difficult to ignore. 30 years after democracy, many South Africans still ask whether political freedom has translated into broad economic justice. And perhaps that's why debates about the Constitution remain so emotionally charged. Because for some, it represents hope fulfilled. For others, it represents hope deferred.
Freedom can only come from the oppressed. It can never be negotiated with the oppressor. You know, black people have been poor for a long time, and a lot of them live to please white people because white people have resources. What exactly is black life after liberation? Living side by side with white people to hug and kiss was not what we fought for. Pleasing them was not what we fought for. We've not built a single city for 30 years post-apartheid. In fact, we've messed up the ones we found.
30 years is a long time. Long enough for a generation to be born, graduate, find work, raise children, and judge whether a promise has been fulfilled. Which brings us back to today. Because the Constitution isn't simply a legal document, it's become something much bigger. It's become a symbol. For some, it symbolizes the birth of democracy. For others, it symbolizes an unfinished transition. And nowhere is that tension more visible than in the expectations people place upon it, a document or a social contract. Every constitution is in many ways a contract, not between government and government, but between a nation and itself. It answers fundamental questions. Who belongs? What rights do people have? How should power be limited? What responsibilities does the state carry? South Africa's constitution begins with a bold vision, a country founded on human dignity, equality, freedom, non-racialism, non-sexism. Those ideals are difficult to argue against. The challenge has always been turning those ideals into lived reality, because equality on paper and equality in everyday life are not always the same thing. One of the most quoted lines in South African political history comes not from the Constitution itself, but from the 1955 Freedom Charter. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. To many, those words represent a rejection of apartheid's racial exclusion. They express the idea that South Africa should be a civic nation where rights are not determined by race. But in today's South Africa, that phrase is interpreted in different ways. Some see it as a moral vision of an inclusive democracy. Others argue that it has become intertwined with difficult debates about immigration, citizenship, public services, and national identity. Those debates have intensified as South Africa has experienced significant legal and irregular migration from across the continent.
People, sometimes they hear stories like South Africa is good, there you can do whatever you like, here you can break rules, there's no rules. Because a lot of African immigrants who are coming here, mostly, they like it because the justice system is not okay, to be honest. Yeah, you have too much weaknesses. Because all these people, if you can ask me, they use the border. You see? Yeah, we've been caught many times. Like me, my job is DSTV. I've been caught with the police, but look now, I was free to walk in the street. Because once they caught you, they don't take you to justice. They deal with you same time. Give me money or something, they let you go. So that's why people like it here. So we just ask one thing. When we go back, when you manage to clean the way you want, please try to fix your justice system. That's only. Mind you, I tell you again, we come here sometimes to find a green pasture. So I'm sure home we will try to make our own green pasture. Because all Africa, we have a problem. One problem is coming from the government. Yeah. I'm sure even this issue, somehow, it's coming from the top. You see, only they follow the wrong routine to chase us away.
Some citizens feel the state has struggled to manage its borders and enforce immigration law effectively. Others argue that frustrations about unemployment and public services are too often directed at migrants instead of deeper structural problems. These are complex issues, and they cannot be reduced to a single sentence in a constitutional or historical document. But they illustrate something important. Even the most inspiring ideals can become the subject of intense political disagreement when they meet the realities of everyday life. Perhaps that's why South Africa's constitution is now being judged less by what it says and more by what people feel. If you ask a constitutional scholar, they may point to the courts, the Bill of Rights, and the independence of key institutions as evidence that the Constitution has been remarkably successful. If you ask someone who still lives without reliable services, struggles to find work, or sees little change in their economic circumstances, the answer may be very different. Both perspectives are real. One evaluates the Constitution as a legal framework. The other evaluates it through lived experience. And those are not always the same measurement.
You don't have a constitution if you've not constituted what should constitute your state after colonialism. If you want to know whether the constitution is the best constitution in the world, as we say, go ask the person who will sleep without food tonight. Everyone who has said this phrase is someone who's comfortable. They have a blanket tonight. They have food to eat. Everyone who says we have the best constitution in the world is usually a lawyer.
So, was South Africa's constitution a Trojan horse? That depends on what you mean. If by Trojan horse we mean a deliberate deception, to some extent, yes. At the same time, history doesn't support such a simple conclusion, although some elements of how the whole thing happened are questionable. The constitutional negotiations were public, complex, and shaped by competing interests on all sides. But some meetings were not public, so we will never really know and have the full picture. The compromises were debated then, and they continue to be debated today. But perhaps there is another way to think about the metaphor. Maybe the Trojan horse wasn't the Constitution itself. Maybe it was the belief that one extraordinary document could solve problems created over centuries, that democracy alone would erase inequality, that rights on paper would automatically become opportunities in practice, that reconciliation would naturally produce justice. Those expectations were enormous, perhaps impossibly so. A constitution can define a nation's aspirations, but it cannot, by itself, build the society those aspirations describe. That requires institutions, leadership, economic growth, accountability, and the difficult work of politics, generation after generation. So, is South Africa's constitution one of the best in the world? By many legal standards, it very well may be. But perhaps that was never the only question that mattered. Because the people living under a constitution don't experience it as lawyers do. They experience it through the schools their children attend, the jobs they can or cannot find, the safety of their communities, the opportunities available to them, the dignity they feel in everyday life. And perhaps that's why this debate refuses to disappear, not because South Africans disagree about the value of freedom, but because they continue to ask what freedom was ultimately supposed to deliver. 30 years after democracy, the Constitution remains one of the country's greatest achievements. It is also one of its greatest conversations. And maybe, just maybe, the true measure of a constitution isn't whether the world praises it. It's whether the people who live under it believe its promises are becoming reality. Because history doesn't only remember the gifts a nation receives, it remembers what those gifts eventually became.